One of the things that tends to get overlooked in a lot of modern discussions of battle royale games is that they had a surprisingly small start. And surprisingly slow, all things considered. The term itself has existed for a while, but its modern meaning of large-scale, free-for-all, fight to the death comes from the 1999 Japanese book Battle Royale by Cautionary. However, for my money, I never understood how The Hunger Games wasn't where it all started. I was in my early teens during the Hunger Games craze, and let me tell you, if they'd released a tie-in Battle Royale game based on the Hunger Games in 2010 to 2014, that shit probably would have made more money than Suzanne Collins would have known what to do with. And there was demand for it. People wanted something that could kind of capture that feeling. But part of the problem is that this wasn't really a genre in gaming at that time. A decade ago, we just straight up didn't have the concept of a modern battle royale game, and that's hard to imagine given how popular it is today. In the absence of any big studios trying to cash in on that, we got scrappy little Xbox Live Arcade games, Minecraft Hunger Games, modded battle royale modes for other games, and eventually some games trying to add in a battle royale as a side mode. For most people, this is where the genre's story begins. PUBG Battlegrounds, which began life as a DayZ mod by PlayerUnknown, and Fortnite Battle Royale, which began life as a companion to Fortnite Save the World. Both released in 2017 and took off, codifying most of the tropes of the genre that we still see today. However, there's a bit of a missing link in the chain here. How did we get from mods and companion modes to full-on standalone games? What convinced Bluehole to develop PUBG? What convinced Fortnite to introduce a Battle Royale mode? Who made the first leap into this brave new world? Who paved the way for one of the biggest genres in modern gaming?
Get ready, contestants! This is The Culling! Welcome to the deadliest game show ever imagined! Contestants will go to extreme measures to be the last one standing. Prepare yourself for combat in an adrenaline-soaked, blood-stained battle royale arena.
The subject of today's video, The Culling, is legitimately one of the most insane bag fumbles in the history of gaming. The first standalone battle royale game was introduced in February of 2016 and entered early access in March of the same year. And it blew up fast. It was one of the biggest games on Steam in terms of concurrent players at the time, and it solidified this new genre of battle royale as something that could successfully stand on its own 2 feet. It is also a game you have almost certainly never heard of, and if you have, it's probably not for a good reason. That's a bit weird though, isn't it? The Culling was legitimately really popular when it launched, and I'm saying that from first-hand experience. I adored The Culling. I played a ton, both solo and with my cousin in duos, and I was active in the forums. I was a huge fan of this game. I had loved the Hunger Games as a kid, and it felt like finally somebody was giving me what my 12-year-old self had been begging for. And look, you won't catch me calling a game dead willy-nilly. I've made entire videos about how another popular game that I fell in love with in 2016 isn't dead, and how frustrating it is that people keep trying to call everything under the sun an Overwatch killer. And I'll stand by that here too. PUBG and Fortnite weren't the Culling's killers, but it's not because the Culling isn't dead either. Rather, it's because by the time they landed and armed themselves, the Culling was already choking on its own blood in the corner. I mean, the game itself had 4 separate releases. The early access in 2016, the full release in 2017, a reboot in 2018, and then another semi-reboot on Xbox in 2020. By the end of 2020, the game's servers were offline everywhere. Even if you wanted to play it today, the only way to do so is to download the free demo from the Xbox store and play offline against bots, which is why that's most of the footage you'll be seeing in the background of this video. Please do not judge my aim. The last console shooter I played consistently was Halo Reach when I was 12. There was also The Culling 2, released on July 10th, 2018. A game that earned the record for the shortest living online multiplayer game of all time after Xavier killed it just 8 days later on the 18th. For context, Concord made it 15 days, and Concord wasn't a sequel to the very first standalone game in one of the biggest genres in the medium. I'm not the first person to make a retrospective on this game. There are a lot of very good videos about The Culling that go into the horrendous business decisions that killed it stone dead and made sure it could never come back, and I do recommend checking out some of them too if you're interested. However, something I've noticed from watching these videos is that it feels like they're usually being made by people who weren't really in it the way that I was. A lot of them are coming in after the body's gone cold and trying to put together the pieces from there. And I think that leads to them making a key mistake when they perform their autopsies and try and identify the cause of death. Don't get it twisted, I don't think these people are wrong about what killed this game for the most part. I just think that they're missing the fact that those business decisions were a symptom of bigger problems that began much earlier in the game's lifespan. And so, while the bizarre business decisions of Xaviant, the developer of The Culling, will definitely be a part of this video, they're not the primary thing I want to focus on. That's a cautionary tale for the business side of the gaming industry for sure, but I want to look more at the developers and how they handled audience input. Like I said, I was active on those forums back in the day, and I remember how they handled it. And even at the time, it spelled trouble. Before we get into how they broke it though, we'll probably have to start with what it was they broke in the first place. However, first, quick announcement. I'm collaborating with Double Summon Games on their new TTRPG, Despair Dilemma. The players take the role of the masterminds, competing with each other to steer the direction of the game and achieve their own unique goals. I'm going to be writing one of the death sheets for it that'll be included in the official hardcover game book if we reach the stretch goal. And if you've enjoyed my past videos about killing games, then I promise you will love the scenario I'm cooking up for it. Before you ask, no, this is not a sponsorship. They reached out to me last year because they liked my videos about Inescapable and Your Turn to Die, and from there asked me to write this. There was no requirement to promote it. This is being done entirely of my own volition because it's legitimately just a project I'm excited about. Link to their current crowdfunding campaign is in the description, and there will be a bit more info about it at the end. But anyways, with that out of the way, on to the actual video.
To the victor goes the victory.
Part 1. What inspired the Culling? Part of what makes the Culling so interesting is that it's both the first game in its genre, but also really not. Technically, it's the first standalone game that wasn't just a mod or a side mode to another game, but like, PUBG was still created first as a mod back in 2013, and it was even directly inspired by Battle Royale. Actually, on that note, it's probably important to remember that this was all happening when the Hunger Games was very much so fresh on everyone's mind. Early articles like this one from PC Games even labeled it, quote, the first dedicated Hunger Games / Battle Royale style multiplayer game on Steam, which kind of shows that even the genre's name wasn't really settled yet. What this means for our purposes is that the Culling was in a weird position of technically having precedent in theory, but not really much of it in practice. The tropes of the genre and the medium of video games as we see them today didn't really exist until PUBG and Fortnite, so it's worth exploring what the Culling was pulling its inspiration from. And honestly, I think the best place to start is with how the game pitched itself in that February announcement trailer.
In a remote island paradise, 16 contestants will have 20 minutes to explore, scavenge items, craft weapons, build traps, hunt and kill each other.
That's obviously not the full story of the game, but even just from that, we can see some really notable things, especially in terms of where the influence was coming from. PUBG was inspired by Battle Royale, like I said, which featured 50 students fighting to the death, so a huge, seemingly insurmountable number of enemies was a central part of the premise. That doesn't really apply to the Culling, so that might lead you to believe that that means the Culling is instead pulling more from the Hunger Games, which only featured 24 tributes, most of whom were basically filler to begin with. However, if we're being real, I bet the bigger inspiration for that number actually came from somewhere else. Somewhere like... I know it might sound a bit weird to think about it in a Battle Royale context, but I am being serious here. Survivor's slogan was literally 39 days, 16 people, 1 survivor. The core premise of the show being that 16 people would be marooned on a tropical island, scrounging up supplies and fighting to survive against one another in the elements to win the $1 million. Later seasons have gotten a bit less cruel and a bit less demanding, but in the early ones you were exploring the island, scavenging supplies, crafting shelter, building alliances, and plotting to vote one another out. Which lines up pretty nicely with 16 contestants have 20 minutes to explore, scavenge items, craft weapons, build traps, hunt, and kill each other. Only one will be crowned the winner. Hell, even the announcer's tone is really similar to Jeff Probst, and that's because the Culling is pulling more from reality TV with a lot of its flavor and framing. The announcer will pipe up throughout the match to announce when a player dies and how they were killed, similar to how Jeff Probst will pipe up about how someone's flopping in a challenge.
Ding ding ding! Thrown knife kill achievement unlocked. I'm just kidding. I don't know anything about achievement, but you have achieved the prize that accompanies a job well done. There you go. There's your achievement.
Troyzan, not even close. The men continue to be pathetic in this challenge.
The contestants are on the island to win a prize, and they need to be the last man standing.
39 days, 16 people, 1 survivor.
I know this sounds like a tangent and like just surface level stuff, but it actually helps to explain a fair bit of the Culling's mechanics in terms of what was prioritized and how they were incorporated. Crafting is a really good example of this. In most battle royales, it's just not a thing. You don't craft. You pick stuff up and might build stuff, but you're given proper weapons for killing people. However, in Survivor, you're meant to scavenge and craft what's necessary to survive. You have to build your own shelter and your own tools when you land on the beach, and it's only by winning challenges that you might earn better resources. And of course, losing a challenge on Survivor means either going without a reward or potentially getting eliminated. In a very real sense, you're rewarded for outlasting your competitors as they're picked off, and if you're the last man standing, you walk away a millionaire. The Culling is the same way. You're rewarded for surviving and playing the game. And that's actually the next big difference here. Funk. Funk is the Culling's currency, and everything is governed by it. Crafting costs funk. Healing at health stations costs funk. You can recycle items you don't want for more of it. You can spend it to call in your pre-selected airdrop, or use it to open up a blue item crate with a high-quality tool inside. You earn funk by scavenging it from across the map, from running a certain distance, from lasting a certain amount of time, and from killing opponents. In other words, play the game, give Culco the show they want, Culco is the company in-universe that's putting on the game, and they'll help you win. It's like if Inescapable was written by people who'd actually heard of reality TV before. This is also, incidentally, a similarity that's kind of shared with the Hunger Games and its sponsors. If a tribute performs for the cameras, the wealthy can choose to send in essential goods to help them out. It's just that in the Culling, this is a lot more of like a literal direct reward for playing it as opposed to having to win over the audience type of thing. However, this is something notably absent from the Battle Royale side of the genre, since the in-universe Battle Royale was a secretive fascist project where people were not supposed to know what exactly was happening inside. Winning didn't mean fame and glory, you weren't a victor. It was just pure survival, and there were no spectators aside from the organizers. Not to go on a huge tangent here, but one of the most interesting things about the Hunger Games versus Battle Royale is that Suzanne Collins was inspired by flipping through channels one night and seeing reality TV shows contrasted with footage from the Iraq War. Whereas Koshan Takami was inspired by a dream he had where a teacher from a drama show he watched told his class he was going to make them all kill each other. He told his friends about it and they said it sounded like a wrestling battle royale, which, again, the term itself predates Battle Royale, the book, but this specific meaning comes from there. Both the Hunger Games and Battle Royale share some pretty obvious similarities aside from just the core concept. You know, there's the exploration of just how many people have to be evil for a system like this to run, how an oppressive state turns people against one another rather than against the system, how the state controls people through demonstrations of its power and the powerlessness of anyone else to stop it. You know, that sort of thing. However, a big difference is that the Hunger Games uses it as entertainment and spectacle. The games are broadcast to the entire country and the reapings are a major event.
Dramatic turn of events here in District 12. District 12's very first volunteer drinker-up.
Battle Royale doesn't do any of that. The students are kidnapped by the government without anyone knowing what happened to them, and the outside world only knows who won based on whose kid actually came home. Panem controls through fear gained via spectacle. The Republic of Greater East Asia controls through fear gained by this invisible threat. There's also an interesting comparison to be drawn between these sorts of battle royales and the broader killing game genre of media. If we keep this Hunger Games versus Battle Royale dichotomy going, I could point out that Danganronpa is more in the vein of the Hunger Games or the Culling in terms of the spectacle of it, whereas Your Turn to Die or Zero Escape are probably more Battle Royale style games where it's for a private audience rather than a public one. In a previous video, I've drawn a distinction between killing games and death games, but for our purposes, I also want to draw the line between those and a battle royale. For both a death game and a killing game, there needs to be more of a rigid, formalized rule set for artificially slowing down the pace of the bloodshed. Danganronpa has its trials, Your Turn to Die has the main games, Zero Escape has its escape rooms, etc. A battle royale, by contrast, is basically pure anarchy. It's just a ruthless slaughter of one another with the system actively trying to incentivize the death to happen sooner rather than later. Like, Monokuma will set rules stating you can only kill a certain amount of people at a certain point in the story. You know, you can only kill up to 2 people in most of the games. But in the Hunger Games, the game makers force the tributes closer to one another with traps, and will add incentives like a feast or a necessary supply for everyone at the center of the map to draw them in. In Battle Royale, the students all wear metal collars that'll explode if they linger in one of the forbidden areas, which are parts of the map that are randomly shuffled to force the students into contact. And if 24 hours pass without a single death, everyone's collar will explode. In the Culling, we can see a lot of both of these. I'll talk about it a bit more in the next section when we get into mechanics, but sometimes it's pretty blatant. For example, the Man Tracker is a device in the Culling which gives you the direction and distance to your nearest opponent, which is really similar to Hiroki Sugimura's starting item in Battle Royale. The Culling will occasionally send in a free airdrop that flies slowly across the map with a bright orange flashing light that anyone can either follow to pick up or intercept by shooting it down, with the goal being to draw the players out into a fight over it. Which is just a classic Hunger Games game maker trick. All of that to say, like I said at the beginning of this section, the Culling technically had to break new ground. But in practice, it was more about figuring out how to synthesize all these different things that were all kind of in the orbit of this sort of new gaming genre, but none of which really codified much. The biggest issue for them was that most of these inspirations weren't video games, and that meant they weren't really going to work the same way. The Culling had to be more fair than Battle Royale, which gave some characters machine guns as starting weapons and gave others forks or boomerangs. The Culling had to be something fun to participate in, which meant that the participants had to be framed as more willing and eager participants than the Hunger Games tributes. Even when people said they wanted a Hunger Games game, they didn't want the despair of these children. They wanted to feel like they were just playing a harmless version of this killing game. In stark contrast to both cases, and in contrast to most similar media of the past, the Culling was fundamentally not a bad thing that had to be destroyed. It was just a fun, if deadly game, and one that was meant to keep being fun to play. It was a modern gladiator duel with a reality TV twist, and that also meant it made more sense to frame it like Survivor, where the contestants are relatively disposable. Something unique about the Culling, though, is that its contestants had to be totally fungible. In the Hunger Games, it matters who these kids are, it matters what districts they're from, and it matters what they can individually do. In Battle Royale, the students bring in their trauma from the real world. Some of them are cruel as a result of the abuse they've experienced, or more experienced in certain weapons or types of combat. And an explicit goal of the Killing game is to encourage them to get as cruel and violent as possible so that the people back home learn to never trust anyone. After all, these kids went to school together, and yet within hours they were hacking each other to pieces with ice picks. In both stories, there were main characters that the audience got to follow, but there can be no main character in the Culling, and you might not get much of an arc yourself. Battle Royale and the Hunger Games have a ton of nameless, faceless characters who die on the first day just to demonstrate how deadly the games are and to filter down the numbers to something a bit more workable for a narrative. But the story isn't about those characters. In the Culling, you might be one of those characters, and that wasn't something people had come to really digest yet. People wanted to be the main character, they didn't want to be a side character. And while we've gotten more used to that now because that's become more of a staple of the genre, you gotta remember that this is where people were coming from in 2016. Even in Survivor, though, the castaways aren't random people. They're cast based on their personalities, what the producers think they'll bring to the show, and what narrative roles they can fulfill. Are you a Parvati, an Ozzy, a JT, a Russell Hantz? Sure, each season is usually a bunch of new people, they replace them each time, they're not permanent cast members, but they also did still individually matter, and then some of them would get brought back for future seasons and extend their storylines. The Culling couldn't do any of that. Its contestants have to be entirely blank slates, and all of this stuff combined means that a lot of what makes this sort of killing game / survival game compelling as part of a narrative can't really be applied to a killing game video game without a narrative. However, that's mostly focusing on a lot of the thematic or conceptual inspiration. How did that actually play out in terms of mechanics? Part 2. How the Culling played. The Culling had some really interesting gameplay mechanics that don't really show up anywhere else in the genre anymore. For example, unlike most battle royales, it was primarily melee combat oriented. Sure, it was often pretty clunky melee, but that was the main focus. You could get bows and then craft more arrows out of branches, and if you were really lucky, you could get one of the 3 guns, only one of which you could craft more ammo for, and only by standing next to an explosive barrel for an extended period of time, but I digress. But it was mostly knives, spears, axes, hammers, and other melee weapons. That didn't mean you couldn't fight at range, though. The Culling also had a dedicated throw button for whenever you decided to chuck whatever you were holding at your opponent, and personally this was actually my favorite way to play. I'd just craft a bunch of cheap stone knives and chase after people, chucking them at them until they died. There were also sometimes things like grenades, traps, and non-damaging weapons, but the first 2 are pretty self-explanatory, and the latter one is something I'll be getting into in a sec. Anyways, the different types of weapons weren't just arbitrary. Each type inflicted a status effect when you were hit by them. Blades inflicted a damage over time bleeding effect. Bludgeons, like hammers, inflicted an expose effect that increased damage taken from your next hit. Spears would deal pierce damage that destroyed your armor faster than other weapons, and axes would deal both bleed and expose, but at weaker levels than equivalent blades or bludgeons. The quality of the weapon also affected the effects, like a higher quality blade would inflict more bleed damage and stuff like that. Other effects included being poisoned, achieved by getting hit by a blow dart or a punji stick trap. Crippled, achieved by getting hit with an explosive or falling off a cliff. Snared, achieved by running into a snare, and probably at least one more that I'm forgetting. I can't get footage of a lot of these because the bots don't really know how to put down snares. I apologize for that. Ranged weapons usually didn't have these sorts of status effects unless that was the only thing they could do, like the blow dart gun, but that was the trade-off. Dealing damage at range kept you safer, but it meant you couldn't chain together effects the way that melee weapons could. In more modern battle royales, where it's more gun-focused, the trade-off between different types of weapons is more based on stuff like range, spread, damage per bullet, stuff like that. What would you use a shotgun for as opposed to an assault rifle, that sort of thing. The Culling also offered perks that you'd select before the match that would provide you with various buffs. Things like providing you with certain utility items when you spawned, or giving you persistent health regeneration, or increasing your damage with certain weapons, stuff like that. This meant that you'd usually enter a match with some level of a strategy in mind. If your perks revolved around blades, that's what you'd focus on. You'd start crafting knives right away. You might pick safe bets like increased maximum health because that'll always help you out, or you might take a gamble and burn a perk on a type of weapon that you probably won't get but which you'll be devastatingly deadly with if you can find it. As mentioned earlier, you also get to pick from a list of pre-built airdrops before the match that you could call in at a designated airdrop pad for a set amount of funk. These could be stolen, like someone else could shoot it down or just kill you and then take it, but this still allows you to bring in a weapon of your choice and some extra items. If you're smart, you'd use this to compensate for those sorts of weaknesses in your perks. You might pick a perk that gives you extra funk every time you collect it, and then another one that relies on a rare or specific type of weapon, and then pick an airdrop you think you can probably afford pretty early on that includes that specific type of weapon so that you can capitalize on it. Now, the last big difference I'll talk about is how the game actually played. Like, we've talked about mechanics, but we haven't really talked about what the game actually felt like. And it was pretty different in a lot of big ways. For one, you didn't drop into the Culling from above. You spawned in a random box on the map. For another, the matches were played on a timer, with 2 map events happening at some combination of the 4-minute mark, the 10-minute mark, and the 18-minute mark that were designed to force the players closer together. These might include things like a button in the center of the arena called the Culmination that activates every poison trap in the map at once, all without warning. Or the temperature on the map might rise and deal damage to anyone who's not indoors for the duration of the event. Or drones might fly around the Culmination in the endgame carrying 3 airdrop packages, 2 of which are booby-trapped. Speaking of the Culmination, one of the biggest differences between the Culling and most modern battle royales is that the map always closes in on the same final spot, that being the aforementioned Culmination, a big metal structure in the middle of a large shallow puddle. This was kind of a middle ground between a lot of old battle royale games and what we see today. In stuff like the Hunger Games, there would sort of be an attempt to push people towards something, but it wasn't always the center, although I think it was in both of the main books. In Battle Royale, it was just kind of any location that they could force everyone together into. And in both of those circumstances, they didn't have like a circle that closed in. It was just kind of environmental hazards that would show up to push you out, And then you look at more modern battle royale games, you've got Fortnite, you've got Apex, you've got PUBG. And in those games, the circle is a circle. It's some sort of a hazard that will slowly close in, and it'll close in on a random location that the players don't know from the start. In the Culling, you still have that circle, but you also have a central location that it always closes in on. And you might think this makes things boring, but they balanced it in a few clever ways. For one, the Culmination is in the middle of a wide open area with no cover, and running in the water is pretty loud. Anyone in the surrounding jungle or buildings will not only see and hear you, but they'll be able to attack from cover. And that goes double for anyone who got to the Culmination first and is already set up there. And you might think, okay, well that would just enable and encourage camping, right? But the Culling has a few interesting counters to that, the most notable of which being the Man Tracker. Like I mentioned a bit earlier, the Man Tracker is a GPS that you can pick up that will tell you the direction and distance to your nearest opponent, which is insanely powerful, obviously, but with a couple key drawbacks. You have to stand still to use it. It takes a couple seconds to activate, and it immediately shuts off if you try and move. I think at some point you could use it while moving, like that shows up in the trailers and stuff, but I genuinely never remember it working like that. That might just be my memory playing tricks on me, but everything I remember about this game is it having to be static. It's good for spot checking if anyone's close. Maybe you want to do something that's going to be a bit noisy, like using a machine, and you want to make sure no one's going to come by, or you want to check and see if anyone's creeping up on you while you're trying to get your airdrop. But it was especially good at negating a camper's advantage by giving away their position. You could just see if someone was standing still on the other side of the wall, and they might not know that you know that yet. Plus, you can't really earn funk if you're just sitting in the center, and there's usually nothing to loot there either. You don't want to go into the middle until you're prepared for the final fight. And while getting there first means you have the defender's advantage and maybe can set up some traps, it also means that your opponent gets more time to arm themselves to fight you. The Man Tracker was probably the biggest non-damaging weapon in the game, but there was also another one that's worth mentioning. The Alarm Gun, which dealt basically no damage. I think it was maybe literally 0, but I think it was probably 1. But it would make its targets blare a loud radio broadcast for about 2 minutes. Which is to say, for 2 minutes, you were the loudest thing on the map. The lack of gunfire and the small match populations meant that it was often very quiet and very tense. And so getting hit by an alarm gun that made you the loudest thing in the match meant you were probably going to be fucked. If you were losing a fight and wanted to make sure that your death was going to be avenged, you could just pull out the alarm gun and pop your opponent with it and, sit and watch it happen. And you would be forced to watch it happen. The culling didn't let you leave and re-queue once you lost, at least not without a leavers penalty. You were stuck spectating the survivors until somebody won, which meant that if you died early, you might spend about 20 minutes just watching this game that you didn't get to play if you didn't want that penalty. The intention behind it was that you'd spectate the full match because it was meant to be a spectator game, and this was meant to also make it more popular as a streaming game, which was an interesting choice that would have some later consequences, but we'll get to that in a sec. You could also play the culling in teams, like I mentioned at the very beginning, but the only real difference is that you had a teammate on the map. You didn't even spawn in together, you'd have to find each other, and it was very possible for your teammate to die before you ever found them, and there was no way to bring him back. Anyways, so I think at this point we've answered the question of what the culling was. We've probably spent too much time on it. Now it's time to get into what actually killed it, starting with Part 3, Wine and Cheese. If you're even remotely familiar with Battle Royale games, you know that there's at least some merit in playing like a rat to some degree. Hiding out on the edges of the map, avoiding fights, and just generally trying to make it as far as possible without having to actually face a skill check that might go poorly. You'll also know that it's not uncommon for certain weapons, strategies, or even characters in more hero-based Battle Royales like Apex Legends to simply not be viable, and that a meta always starts to show up. This was true for the culling as well. Frankly, it's been so long that I can't remember what the metas were when I played, but for myself, I know I almost always picked Golden Arm, Backpack, and Man Tracker. The Man Tracker was just way too useful of an item to risk not having. Backpack allowed me to hold 5 items instead of 3 right out of the gate, and Golden Arm's 100% increase to damage and velocity for thrown weapons meant that my preferred strategy of throwing everything in my expanded inventory at the enemy was extremely viable and extremely dangerous. By my recollection, Golden Arm was so common it might as well have been a default perk. There was never a point in the game where being able to double your damage with thrown weapons and throw them twice as fast wasn't going to be useful unless you deliberately chose to play differently, and it was one of the early points of contention that came up. Now, in a game like this, there are 2 types of OP. There's OP stuff that everyone can use, and OP stuff that's locked behind some sort of a skill check. The former would be stuff like the Man Tracker, which was actually really good for leveling the playing field. If you were new, or just bad, the Man Tracker meant you couldn't get snuck up on, which gave you a fighting chance, and if you were good at it, then it made it easier to hunt down your next target. Plus, both groups still had to stand still and basically disarm themselves to use it, which is especially bad in a game focused on melee combat where getting jumped while pulling out the Man Tracker would probably mean that you're panicking while getting axed to death, which are the perfect conditions for not being able to remember where your own weapons were in your inventory and dying before you can swap to them. Point is, everyone would agree that it was strong, but you'd never convince the community that it should be deleted. The most you'd get is arguments about whether or not it should be usable while moving, but even then, still a relatively minor argument. The latter kind of OP is stuff like Golden Arm, where not everybody could get the same utility out of it, and it became possible to cheese it pretty easily. If you, like me, immediately jumped out of spawn and started picking up every rock you could find to craft them into knives, Golden Arm made you an absolute menace in the early game, especially before people had armor or bows or any way to really fight back at range. According to the wiki, which somehow still exists for this game, crafted knives dealt 21 base damage at full charge when thrown, meaning that Golden Arm gave them 42 damage. You probably won't see that in the footage in the background because again, it's on a weird patch and honestly I don't even know if the wiki's information is truly reliable, but it's the best I can do. Plus, don't forget, they're knives, so they also applied a bleed effect, which would deal an additional 6 damage over 10 seconds because they were the worst knives. Remember, most ranged weapons didn't deal a status effect, but that trade-off is negated if you literally have to throw your weapon at the person to use it. You can fire a bow a lot of times and still have a bow in your hand, but you can only throw a knife once before you don't have a knife anymore, and now your opponent has an extra knife to try and stab you to death with. You also weren't limited to weapons that necessarily suited being thrown, or even weapons at all. You could throw your Man Tracker at an opponent if you wanted, and there are few funnier ways to win the culling than by throwing a blackberry like a fucking fastball at the back of some poor guy's head while he's trying to flee. All that to say, if you didn't have any armor, 3 fully charged knives from someone with Golden Arm could kill you even if you had the big boned perk. Now, to be clear, this was actually not that hard to deal with. You could use the Man Tracker to avoid early game encounters. You could pick the Maniac perk, which reduced all incoming damage by 25% as long as you were holding an axe, and then just craft an axe in the early game. You could pick Tough Mother to reduce all incoming damage by 10%. Or you could just get good and learn how to throw the knives back at your opponent better than they can. Sure, better players would still fuck you up, but like... yeah, of course they will. That's how games work. Some cheese strats are inevitable, and sometimes you've just got to suck it up and deal. However, much like the French, gamers love to respond to some cheese with some wine. This is where the majority of those, character/weapon/perk/abilities overpowered, please nerf posts on Reddit will come from, regardless of what game we're talking about. People whining about whatever just killed them because they want to vent their frustrations about something that felt like bullshit. We all know it, and most of us have probably been there. The problem for the Culling is that Xavian didn't really know how to respond to the whining, and that was for a few reasons. As established, the Culling was breaking new ground. It was the first true standalone game of its genre, and it was hard to really know what it should feel or play like. What strategies should be rewarded, and which ones should be nerfed? How do you keep a match competitive for people of varied skill levels? What's the appropriate range of skill levels to put into a match together? Regardless of how much fun something might be, or how unfun it might be, how essential is it to the actual intended gameplay experience? Maybe something that's not fun is actually good for balance, something I want to make a whole video about at some point. But nobody really knew what constituted balance in the first place in this genre. Remember, most of the inspirations for it were narrative media where it didn't need to be balanced, and oftentimes the imbalance was part of the narrative. The careers almost always win the Hunger Games because of an unfair advantage, and these sadistic, violent bullies in Battle Royale usually get an advantage over their kind and empathetic classmates, not to mention the people who got a gun as opposed to a fork. In the Culling, you had to actually work around this stuff. It had to be a game, not just a narrative device. This is true of all games to some extent, but a unique challenge of Battle Royales to this day that the Culling was running into headfirst like a brick wall was that, fundamentally speaking, the majority of players in any individual match of a Battle Royale are gonna die early and probably not have that much fun. Only about 10% of the people who start a match in a Battle Royale are going to actually live long enough to have a good time, and only one of them is actually going to win, which is pretty fundamentally different from how basically every other genre of games works. If you were playing Overwatch in 2016, half the players in every match were winners. That meant for every 6 disgruntled players whining about how they'd lost, you had 6 who were happy they'd won. What's more, a team-based game meant that winning ultimately wasn't very rare. If you play 10 games of Overwatch or Rivals or whatever, you're almost guaranteed to win the coin toss on at least one of them. The same isn't true of Battle Royales though. In Fortnite or PUBG, only 1 to 4 people out of 100 are winners. In Apex Legends, it's only 1 to 3 out of 60, and in Supervive, it's 3 out of 30. I think. They just changed this to trios while I was working on it, and that might not actually be the match size, but you get the idea. The point is that that's already pretty slim odds, but in a weird way, I think this actually makes it feel less frustrating to lose. In a 100-person free-for-all, you know that even if you're objectively the best, the odds of you winning are still pretty low because there's just so many people involved. Plus, worst case, you're able to immediately re-queue after losing, so you don't have to stew in whatever killed you for too long. However, as you may recall, the Culling forced you to sit and watch the rest of the match, which meant everyone who died early was not just pissed about whatever killed them, but also about not being able to keep playing. Death in the Culling didn't just mean taking an L, it meant you couldn't keep playing until this match was over. This was all meant to encourage people to spectate the Culling and make it a better streaming game, but what it actually did was guarantee that people who met 2 key conditions, namely being bad at the Culling and wanting to play it a lot, were spending a lot of time waiting for matches to end, which is also a lot of time to pop over to Reddit and whine about whatever cheese strat killed you. If I killed you in the first 3 minutes with my man tracker and 4 stockpiled knives that I chucked at you, that meant you'd probably have about 20 minutes to go to the Culling's forums and post about how Golden Arm is bullshit and shouldn't exist. That doesn't happen much in other games. Unless something really pissed you off, you'll just queue up for the next match and move on without making a post somewhere about it. That necessarily serves as a bit of a filter on the complaints the developers of a game like Overwatch receive. There's not really a point where the game forces you to take a long enough break that you have time to complain unless you choose to not play the game in order to go complain. And you're unlikely to do that unless something pissed you off a pretty considerable amount. It doesn't mean that whatever you're pissed about in that scenario is valid, but it does mean that it's not literally everything that's ever annoyed a low-skill player. Even in games like CSGO or Valorant, where dying means you're done till the next round, you usually don't have to wait more than a minute or two between when you could die and when the next round would probably start, which means it's not really enough time to pull up Reddit and write out a whole essay. The Culling, meanwhile, ended up creating the conditions for everyone who's bad at the game to be even angrier at whatever killed them, and then gave them the time needed to rant about it on a forum, and to go show support for everyone else who's doing the same thing. Part of why I brought up the Hunger Games and Battle Royale so much earlier is that also exacerbated this problem for a lot of people. Today, if you think about a Battle Royale, you think of Fortnite or PUBG or Apex, but back then, you thought of the Hunger Games. And the Hunger Games were told from a winner's point of view. Even today, the new Hunger Games movies are about winners. That was the experience people were looking for out of this game. They wanted to be Katniss Everdeen, not one of the dozen nameless children who immediately get slaughtered at the cornucopia. We've normalized it a lot more now because the genre has become more established, but back then it wasn't just the developers who would have been looking at narrative media for inspiration for the genre. The players were also contextualizing battle royales within that context, and you didn't sign up to be Jason Lastname from District 6 who dies so someone more important can get ahead. This is also why I brought up Survivor earlier, because while I think it was an inspiration, they didn't think hard enough about how Survivor feels for the people who get eliminated early, especially the pre-merge boots. Part of what makes a lot of early outs on Survivor bitter and angry is that they never even imagined themselves going home so soon, and they feel like they didn't get a chance to actually play. They didn't get to try out their strategies, they didn't get to play a strategic game, they just got sent home for some bullshit probably, because if you get sent home first on Survivor, odds are you kind of just didn't have time to do anything, so it was just off of vibes. They probably assumed that they'd go far and get to experience the full game because they feel like they're a main character, and it's not fun to realize that you're not. Double that for superfans who wanted to go and experience the iconic parts of the show. You know, a tribe swap, a merge, an auction, a loved one's visit, and the final tribal council. And instead, they go home day 5 and just sit at a resort for a few weeks before going home, knowing that they have forever screwed up their opportunity. They know they'll never get brought back for a future season or get to live the full experience, and it makes them upset. That sort of thing is how a lot of people playing early battle royales, especially the Culling, felt, especially when losing meant they had to sit and spectate. If you combine both of these aspects, well, that's where we get on to our next big point. Part 4. Not all opinions are valid. At this point, you can probably see where things are headed. There's a disproportionate amount of complaints because of the forced spectator time, and they're disproportionately coming from people who will die early. Namely, disproportionately from bad players. These two things combined mean that anything you might have known about how to measure how the general public feels based on a sample population needs to be thrown out the window. And this sort of thing is a legitimate real-world issue whenever you're trying to gauge how a population feels. Political polling companies, for example, have to try and get a large enough group of responses that they're able to reflect the general public, but they also have to be mindful of how they might accidentally be filtering out certain perspectives. The most obvious example is through age. Elderly people are more likely to have a landline and be at home to answer it at 2 p.m. than a 21-year-old. So if that's how you conduct your survey, you need to accommodate that. Working parents are a lot less likely to be interested in spending 10 minutes on the phone when they're trying to put the kids to bed than a retiree who doesn't have anything else to do. If you tried to do it through the internet, you'd have the same problem in reverse. You'll filter out the elderly who don't know how to use the computer or only use it for the bare minimum and won't ever find your survey. If you try to get random respondents, you risk getting people who are just saying whatever they need to get you to fuck off, which is why the Bloc Québécois will sometimes pull above 0% outside of Quebec. But if you only get respondents who actively pursued the chance to fill out a survey, you get too many nerds and not enough normies. If the incumbent government just introduced or passed a controversial policy, people who are opposed to that policy are more likely to respond to express their anger, while people who probably will still vote for them again are more likely to just keep it to themselves for a little bit or say they're unsure, and vice versa if the incumbents do something popular. And again, polling companies try to account for this sort of thing and keep in mind how external factors might skew their data. And skewed data might still be valid data in terms of representing the truth of how respondents feel in the moment, but knowing that it's skewed means you can interpret it more effectively in terms of what it means in the bigger picture. Xavient, meanwhile, seemingly did not keep in mind that they had created the perfect conditions to receive some insanely distorted data about what the community actually felt. When they would get hit with an avalanche of complaints about a perk like Golden Arm, they would react as though this was a normal game. Back in the intro I said, quote, "I want to look more at the developers and how they handled audience input. Like I said, I was active on those forums back in the day and I remember how they handled it. And even at the time, it spelled trouble. And you might have assumed that I meant ignoring the audience. If you did, you were very wrong. They listened way too much to the audience and didn't account for how distorted the audience's feedback was. So they'd listen to the audience and they'd implement changes based off of what they were saying. Then, whenever a patch hit, you'd get the same problem happening all over again. If you nerf Golden Arm, suddenly everyone who relied on it was dying sooner, and they were in the forums prepared to rip everyone a new one for nerfing it, and were especially mad at the people who'd advocated for that. However, this still wasn't proportionate. The nerfs usually weren't going to be enough to push someone from 1st to 10th. Instead, you end up in a position where people at the very top would get fucked over by a nerf, but they'd also still be able to queue up pretty fast because they took like 4th instead of 1st or something. So they'd complain, but not nearly as often or as loudly, and not just out of spur-of-the-moment frustration. If those players wanted to complain, they'd have to choose to spend time complaining over playing the game. The real issue was still at the bottom, because people who were able to get to 8th with Golden Arm might now be ending up in 10th or 12th, and that meant they were now in the peak complain on the forums about the game range. And what's more, if you were consistently failing to make top 10 when old Golden Arm was in the game, you're probably still placing pretty low, so you're still gonna complain too. You'll just find something new to complain about. However, what makes this even worse is that the genuinely average players, people who'd place consistently around the middle of the pack, were the least likely to be heard, and also the least likely to be angry enough to really try and push things. If you consistently placed 5th through 10th, you probably got to play for a decent amount of time. You probably had a chance to get some decent equipment and put up a fair fight, and then you just got beat. You lived long enough to feel like you actually got to play the game and didn't have enough time dead to go to the forums and complain. You also didn't get so close to the end that it felt like you were robbed of a win. People who place second in competitions are often more upset than people who place third because they felt like they were so close to victory, whereas people in third know they got beaten more thoroughly and are just happy to have gotten on the podium. And again, less of your time was being wasted. If you lived for about 10-12 minutes, maybe got a kill or two and then you died, you probably are only going to be in the spectator mode for about 10 minutes, maybe even less. And it's the most exciting portion of the match to watch. If you died in the first couple minutes, everyone was still in scavenger mode and there's not really a lot going on. There's not a lot of fights, and when they do happen, it's usually two people with caveman tools thunking each other over the head. That's just boring to watch. It feels like the antithesis of this being a good thing to spectate, you know? If you die around the halfway mark, the remaining players are probably pretty decent, and they have better equipment, and they're all being forced together by the circle closing in on the culmination. So you're gonna see a bit more action. So, here's the state of play. The worst players will die early, Dunning-Kruger themselves into believing that they're actually amazing, that the game is just bullshit, and then be given 20 minutes where their time is being wasted as a result of the bullshit that killed them that would be perfect to spend complaining about said bullshit on the forums. The best players usually last until the end, and even if they feel slighted, they can still just queue up again and move on if they don't really want to complain. And again, no Dunning-Kruger, they're just good. If something gets egregious though, they will complain, and they'll use their consistently high placements as a way to prove their authority, or make an appeal to authority at least on the subject. The average players are the least likely to be heard of the bunch because they rarely get close enough to the top to feel truly robbed of a victory, and they don't spend as much time in the spectator mode where they're incentivized to go vent in the forums. They'll go take a bathroom break or get water or something. They're not really in an essay writing position. So if you're Xaviant, you're getting basically unusable feedback, but you're using it anyways. You have no idea how your general player base actually feels because the feedback is all skewed. This would be bad enough by itself, but remember, this is still a fundamentally new genre. Even if you want to argue that the Culling isn't technically the first and that prize should go to someone else, it was still early days. This was still the first few years of it. They had no idea what they were doing because they were functionally the first to do it. So not only is their feedback fucked, but they can't even try to find data elsewhere or rely on what they know about the genre. They know nothing. And they're a small studio, so they don't necessarily have the resources to filter through all the bullshit and come up with something good. So instead, they listened to what they could get. And it led to the deaf leading the blind right off a fucking cliff. Part 5. The Cautionary Tale. All of that is the basic point of this video. The lesson is to be very careful about listening to audience feedback and to be aware of how easily skewed the data can be. Xaviant listened to their audience and tried to accommodate them, and instead of fixing anything, it just increased the number of complaints from people who were mad that their shit got broken while the people who sucked just found new things to blame. Strong skill-based abilities or strong risk-reward abilities would repeatedly get nerfed because those were what was complained about, and then it'd make people angry that their things got nerfed, causing the domino effect to continue. The game quickly became less fun for people because there was less variety, causing the Culling to enter what I would call the Skyrim state. Namely, the state of a game where you've filtered out everything fun to the point where there's just a single viable playstyle, such as a stealth archer. And in a single player game like Skyrim, you can kinda just brute force it. You can decide, no, I'm just gonna do what I wanna do, fuck it. Maybe you'll get some mods that improve that experience. But for a multiplayer game, well, once all the ways of playing the game that you found fun got effectively nerfed out of viability, you just stop playing it. And this is the point at which most of the other videos will pick up the story and all the bad business decisions, and where I should expand on what I mentioned around the beginning. After the first game started flopping, Xaviant announced they would halt development on it while it worked on the Culling 2, which it released on July 10th, 2018, only to pull it offline 8 days later. The all-time max player count of the new game was 249 people. Eventually, there was only one at a time. After the Culling 2's failure, Xaviant made a last-ditch attempt to fix the damage. They announced a reboot of the Culling titled The Culling Day 1, which would restore the game to its original early access state from March 2016. This wasn't enough though, and by March of 2019, Xaviant announced that the game was not financially viable. By the end of the month, it was pulled off of Steam and the Xbox Store. They still hadn't given up on it though. On May 12th, 2020, which, hey, my 22nd birthday, I didn't even realize that was when it happened, they had announced it was coming back again. This time, it would be on Xbox One, and it would be labeled The Culling Origins. That is the version of the game that I've been playing in the background. Not the actual base game, because again, I can't play it. You're supposed to be able to, because I bought it back when it was still around, and I have it downloaded, but every time I try, it just crashes, because, I guess, fuck me. And look, people have wanted to have the Culling back for years, so maybe this could have worked. Maybe the Culling Origins could have been when it finally got its comeback. Maybe this could have been Xaviant's mayhem. Or It could be their 314 if they, I don't know, hypothetically implemented a feature where you had to spend tokens to play matches instead of just getting to play unlimited games like in any other game. There's no way they would create a system where you only got one free token per day and any additional games would require you to pay between 25 and 33 cents per additional token, right? Viewer, you will be unsurprised to learn that they did, in fact, do this. In a Battle Royale game. In 2020. A genre that by this point was defined by being able to say, fuck it we ball when you lose, and just re-queue for another one. They eventually changed this to 10 free games per day, but again, insane behavior. Like, I don't know who comes up with that idea. Like, this is not a popular enough game by this point. This was a game that people were like fighting for their lives to defend and praying it would be good. It was not the top charting game. You can't take that kind of behavior here. You can't have that kind of attitude when you're already flopping. Anyways, Origins made it 6 months before the servers were shut down in November. And that was the last of the Culling. The game is still bafflingly available for sale on Xbox though, and do not buy it, obviously. Don't think I need to say that, but just in case someone feels curious. I cannot imagine what you would have to do to get a refund, and you are not going to get to play online. If you truly want to experience whatever the hell I've had to do to get this footage, you can just play the free demo, and then when it says can't connect to servers, just hit the B button on your controller, and then you can play offline against bots. Not that I can say I'd recommend that though. As someone who formerly loved the Culling, it is probably better to leave it as a memory. However, that brings me to the actual cautionary tale of the Culling. A game died. It's sad, but like, inevitable? You know, games don't live long, especially not the first comers to the genre, especially not when it's online multiplayer games from small studios that might not be able to keep the servers on indefinitely. C'est la vie, such is life. What I think is the bigger cautionary tale is how this has made this part of gaming history functionally inaccessible, and what this says about the medium on a bigger level. Part 6. The actual cautionary tale. There was no reason for the Culling to end up in this state. It could have easily continued with community support like so many games before and since. Rounds were small, there didn't need to be that many people to play on a community server to still make it happen. You could look at games like, I don't know, Toontown that have managed to survive with community support in spite of all of the everything that game has gone through. Instead, Xaviant threw a tantrum. They were mad that their game had failed, they were mad that they'd missed the bus, and they were mad that the genre they'd helped to kick off was making millionaires out of seemingly everyone except for them. They refused to allow the game to live on, and refused to give people a way to keep playing. In spite of the fact that half a decade since its last closure and nearly a decade since it was last good, people are still begging for it to happen. r/survive the Culling is still up, and there's still a post every month or so from people wishing they'd been allowed to set up their own servers. And the same goes for the Steam pages. In fact, there's actually a similar game out there right now called Retail Royale, which is basically just the Culling but in an IKEA. And if you look through the Steam reviews of that game, a lot of them are just comparing it to the Culling, talking about how they wish the Culling would come back, but this will do in the interim. Anyways, you might think that this isn't really a cautionary tale for the developers, but that's because you're not thinking about history, about legacy. The history of gaming will inevitably include its chapter on the Battle Royale genre, but Xaviant have made it effectively impossible for anyone to include them in that history. You can't access the game as it was meant to be played anymore. They've made all their developer community messages and forums inaccessible or obsolete, and you can't even find old patch notes. Hell, it's hard to even find release dates for stuff like the Culling Day 1. A lot of people worked really hard on the Culling. And yeah, they fucked it up. They dropped the bag. They were early adopters. It would have been far more shocking if they'd nailed it on the first try and were still somehow running the Battle Royale show today, especially with how big the genre's gotten. Think about some of the other games that either spawn new genres or popularize a specific mini-genre within an existing one. How many of them will still be the games of their genres in a few years? Like, Among Us obviously didn't invent the concept of asymmetrical multiplayer games, but it was massively influential. And yet, even though we're only a few years out from it becoming popular, its successors have taken a lot of the market from it. You know, personally, I think that Goose Goose Duck does it better, but it's obviously up to personal preference. An even better example is probably Lethal Company, which was a silly little game that actually did spawn a functionally new genre, one that we still kind of don't really have a name for. This sort of multiplayer horror scavenging game where you have to collect enough valuable materials to win the level and not be killed. A decade from now, Lethal Company might not be the dominant game in its genre, and it might not even be around. Hell, the genre itself might fade by then. Games like Content Warning and Repo have come along with new takes and refined the concept a bit, and I'm sure we'll see even more over the coming years because that's what happens. The difference here is that Lethal Company and Among Us are still around and still can be preserved. Their spot in the history books is a lot easier to guarantee because there's basically no way for them to disappear altogether even if they were to fall out of popularity. But when the culling failed, largely thanks to what I assume Xavian perceived as a fickle audience that complained and complained and then abandoned them once they convinced them to ruin their own game, but what was actually far more down to their own poor understanding of how to process feedback and then the poor business decisions they made in response, I think they decided that they might as well scrub it. Maybe that was because of shame, or a feeling of pointlessness of keeping it around. But honestly, I think it's more bitterness and pettiness, a feeling that if people wanted the culling, they should have supported it when it was around. They were like a scorned partner who would rather see their ex publicly express their regret about dumping them rather than ever take them back or, God forbid, handle it healthily. But they shouldn't have done it that way. That was a mistake. I think their frustration with their community is why they never allowed anyone to make community servers for it, but this frankly punishes Xavian more than most of the community. The people who enjoyed the game will find alternatives. Maybe, no-name knockoff ones, but they'll still find alternatives. But the people who helped pioneer this genre are just realistically never going to be properly credited for it. The credit for Battle Royale as a genre will almost certainly just go to PUBG and Fortnite. The Culling's status as the first standalone Battle Royale game will at most become a difficult trivia question in a few years. And within a few decades, I kinda don't think people will remember it at all. And you might say, oh well, it's the internet, nothing gets forgotten on the internet, but that's not true. If nobody ever bothered to update the Wikipedia page and then the sites slowly go offline, or if nobody ever bothered to archive any of those sites, then that information can just get lost, and there is no physical copy that anyone can dig up to try and unearth it. This isn't like an old book where the first printing of it might eventually someday be recovered. If the game is gone, and the documentation of it is gone, then it's kinda hard to prove it even really existed. That is the cautionary tale for developers. And really for all of us. Companies erasing their products not only hurts the consumer, it hurts the creators by depriving them of their credit in the history books, and all of us by depriving us of the ability to retell and document our own history comprehensively. When games are incapable of running without the publisher's servers being active, or when essential files can be removed and games made non-functional with no way to fix them, or when developers erase the documentation of their games from the internet, we lose what actually happened in our history. And I know that sounds silly, but think about the history of cinema. Some really important early films are just gone forever, and for a lot of the same reasons as games like The Culling. And if this medium is truly art, then this is the early history of that art, of that new medium disappearing before our eyes. It is impossible for anyone today to experience what it was actually like to play the very first standalone Battle Royale game, and a lot of that comes down to Xavian creating a perfect storm for bad data from audience feedback and not knowing how to process it. The audience was given too much input into this game's management, and Xavian were flying too blind to know how to manage it properly. This video is really about two different cautionary tales. One specific to the culling about audience input, but also this bigger one about how intangible and vaporous the history of gaming is. This doesn't just happen with small indie games either. Overwatch 1 is an incredibly obvious example. That game is now just gone. The game of the year of 2016 is no longer accessible through any of the digital storefronts where people like me bought it, and the physical copies are basically just worthless discs. Sure, Overwatch 2 is pretty similar, obviously, but it's still not the same. There is no way to revisit that past, and the documentation from that time period is already disappearing. News organizations go out of business, social media accounts decay or get deleted, publishers wipe old forum posts, and eventually the medium's history disappears. And it happens at an alarming rate. It's especially true because of stuff like fandom, which is a god-awful company, god-awful website, it shouldn't exist, but people rely on it. And then when fandom does some fuck shit just gets lost. And crucially, it wasn't always like this. The abandonment of physical media and the inability to play offline is really the core of the whole issue. The Culling had no physical release and wasn't meant to be played offline, it was only ever meant to be an online game. And if Xbox ever takes it off their store, which is pretty likely because that's what happens when you move on from one console generation to the next, it'll become inaccessible to literally anyone who didn't already buy it. Hell, even if you did buy it, that doesn't mean it'll keep working. The Steam version doesn't, at least not for me anymore, and I can't do anything to fix that. And eventually the Xbox version will stop working. It's just how it goes. And it's not just about the cultural value of history. It's about what it means for the industry. The expression, those who don't learn from their history are doomed to repeat it, doesn't exist for no reason. Developers coming up today in 2025 have no way to learn from what happened with the culling outside of the YouTube videos people have made in retrospect trying to put the pieces together. But that's not really enough. Eventually the mistakes of Xavian will be repeated. Many of them already have been. And we don't just forget mistakes either. Many of the things that the culling did well, like its crafting, are just gone from the genre for the most part. And what happens someday when YouTube is deleted, or Google purges their servers of old videos, or all the content creators who talked about the culling delete their channels? What remains of the culling? There's no physical documentation, like I can't stress that enough. There's nothing to prove this game even existed a century from now. That is the cautionary tale of the culling, a game that, for all intents and purposes, should have a guaranteed place in the history books of gaming, even if only as the way to explain where one of the medium's most popular genres started from. Instead, this is the state of things. And that sucks.
There we go. To the victor goes the victory. We'll see you next time with more of The Culling, where a delightful group of contestants will lay it all on the line to come out on top. Thanks for watching The Culling. Goodbye, friends.
Thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry for my voice being a little bit fried. I got sick like 2 weeks ago, and I thought I'd be fine like at the end of last week in time to record this, and then for whatever reason I just completely lost my voice. Like it went insanely deep and was basically unusable, and this is the best it's gotten. Anyways, be sure to like, comment, subscribe if you aren't already, and consider becoming a channel member. My channel members get to vote for one video a month for me to make, and this was their pick for March. It is also the first time I've gotten a Members' Choice video out in the same month that they picked it since, oh Jesus Christ, May of 2024. Anyways, if you'd like to have a say in the April poll, you can become a member for $5 a month on either YouTube or Patreon at the links in the description. The next poll opens on April 1st between these 4 topics. How Buried Stars gets social media toxicity right, which would be a return to Buried Stars focusing specifically on how it portrays social media toxicity through its Twitter stand-in Fader, and how that toxicity impacts each of the characters differently. Mythical Pokemon were a bad idea that's only become worse with time, which would be about a long-standing beef I have with Game Freak for creating a category of Pokemon that I, someone who grew up in rural Alberta, would literally never get to access legitimately, and why I think Mythical Pokemon somehow managed to suck even more as a concept over time. Process of elimination is complicated, and I don't know how to talk about it, which would be about what makes Process of Elimination such a confusing, complicated game to talk about, and why that's not necessarily a good or bad thing. Lastly, biting the wax. What happens when you fall for queerbaiting? This is a new topic added as a Donathon reward, and would be about what queerbaiting is/isn't, what it means to fall for it, and how it affects our understanding of media even if we know we're being queerbaited. Like I said, anyone who becomes a member between now and the end of the day on April 10th will get to vote on this once it opens on the 1st, so if you want to have your voice heard, you know what to do. Also, it's been probably nearly an hour since I mentioned it, but I'm going to be part of Double Summon Games' new TTRPG, Despair Dilemma. The scenario I'm writing is called Virtual Killing Academy. A group of 19 strangers wake up on a tropical island with their memories wiped, with one notable exception: their memories of having played the killing game before. You and your fellow players take on the roles of plotting masterminds, each with their own powers, objectives, and motivations. And as such, you'll know the true nature of the killing game. Will you guide them towards the truth? Will you use them for spectacle? It's your choice. Well, if you can outmaneuver your friends as they try and guide them towards the ending they want to see. And once you've played Virtual Killing Academy, well, the game's not done. You can play scenarios in creepy murder mansions, cruise ships, an academy of gifted juveniles, a supernatural village, or even the wreckage of a shipwreck. Double Summon Games approached me back in December to ask if I'd be interested in collaborating with them on this after watching some of my videos, and it's been genuinely really fun to do. I got to bring my own spin to this, but also got to blend a lot of things that inspired me, and if you're a fan of my videos, you'll be able to see influences from Your Turn to Die, Buried Stars, Danganronpa, and, of course, Inescapable in the campaign that I'm writing. This isn't a sponsorship. I don't get a percentage of the revenue or paid from referrals or anything like that. I'm genuinely just encouraging you to go check out their crowdfunding campaign because I think you'd probably enjoy it if you enjoy my work and the genre in general. And I can say from first-hand experience that Double Summon are really big fans of killing game genre as well. Like, they've done their homework to make sure this is a really good game. If you want to contribute to the crowdfunding campaign, $15 US gets you PDFs of the game book. $35 USD gets you a hardcover copy of it, $50 USD adds on a Death Game playing card deck, and $100 USD gets you all that plus a custom pre-made character. The links to everything are down in the description. And if the stretch goal for my campaign does get reached, I'll also be doing a special stream playing it in the near future, so stay tuned. Anyways, usually my conclusions aren't this long, and my voice is getting really fried at this point, so I want to say a thank you to my channel members both for their support and for their patience in waiting for me to get to this part. At the $25 Elite Membership tier, thank you to Jules Coolness. At the $10 Premium Membership tier, thank you to Tortoise and Jatenar and a Ghostbat. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Minnie Q, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Yoshi of the Wire, Cadence, Windex the Great, The Leathers, Gavost, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Good Guy Luis, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Amon Dadley, Meat Cubed, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deku _, Safon, T Laskin, and Lala the Bambi. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.